A quiet resolve. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of a small southern town. The streets were quiet, with only the hum of cicadas breaking the silence. Jaden Matthews, a 12-year-old black boy with wide eyes full of dreams, limped along the sidewalk, his prosthetic leg chafing against his skin in the summer heat. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his tattered backpack, decorated with a small, fraying ribbon, bounced lightly with each labored step. Jaden had grown used to this route, taking it every day from his school to his modest home on the edge of town. It wasn't far, but it often felt like miles. He didn't mind, though. It gave him time to think. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, building prosthetics better than the one strapped to his leg. "I'll design ones that don't hurt," he often told himself, imagining a future where no one had to endure the pain he did. But today felt different. The air was heavier, the quiet more oppressive. As Jaden turned a corner, the distant wail of a siren made his heart quicken. He glanced behind him and saw a police car speeding down the street. Instinctively, he stepped onto the grass, clutching his backpack tightly. The car screeched to a halt next to him, the tires kicking up small clouds of dust. Jaden froze as the door swung open, and out stepped Sheriff Bill Carter, a tall man with a commanding presence and a permanent scowl etched into his face. The sheriff was a fixture in the town, a symbol of authority, feared more than respected. "Hey, boy," Sheriff Carter called out, his voice sharp and cutting. Jaden's pulse quickened as the man approached, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Jaden stood still, unsure of what to do. He had always been taught to be polite and respectful, especially in situations like this. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. "What's in the bag?" the sheriff demanded, eyeing the boy suspiciously. "Just my textbooks, sir," Jaden replied, holding the bag tighter. He could feel his palms growing clammy. The sheriff squinted, his gaze dropping to Jaden's leg. "What's wrong with you? Why you limping like that?" Jaden swallowed hard. "I have a prosthetic leg, sir." Sheriff Carter's expression didn't soften. Instead, a strange grin spread across his face. "A prosthetic, huh?" He leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "What are you hiding in there?" "Nothing, sir," Jaden said quickly, backing away slightly. But the sheriff stepped closer, his large frame looming over the boy. "Hand over the bag," the sheriff barked, snatching it from Jaden's grasp before he could protest. The contents spilled onto the sidewalk: worn textbooks, a few pencils, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil. The sheriff's lips curled in disappointment as he kicked the items aside with his boot. "Textbooks," he muttered, as if the idea of a boy like Jaden carrying schoolbooks was absurd. "What about the leg?" His eyes narrowed. "Maybe you're hiding something in there." Jaden's stomach dropped. "No, sir. There's nothing." "Sit down," the sheriff interrupted, pointing to the ground. Jaden hesitated but obeyed, lowering himself onto the hot pavement. The sheriff bent down and grabbed his prosthetic leg, inspecting it as if it were a piece of contraband. "Let's see what we've got here," he said with a sneer, unfastening the straps. "Please, sir, don't." Jaden began, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the prosthetic being pulled away. He felt exposed and vulnerable, his bare limb now visible to anyone who might be watching. The sheriff held the prosthetic up, turning it over in his hands. "What's this, huh? Got something hidden in here?" He shook it roughly, as if expecting something to fall out. When nothing did, his frustration grew. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Jaden's eyes stung with tears, but he blinked them back. He didn't want to cry. Not here, not in front of this man. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. People whispered amongst themselves, but no one stepped forward to help. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene, while others averted their eyes, pretending not to see. The sheriff tossed the prosthetic onto the ground with a loud clatter. "Get out of here," he growled. "And don't let me catch you causing trouble again." Jaden scrambled to pick up his prosthetic, his fingers fumbling with the straps as he tried to reattach it. His hand shook with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The sheriff climbed back into his car, slamming the door with a force that made Jaden flinch. The car sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Jaden sat there for a moment, staring at the ground. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but no one said a word. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his prosthetic now securely fastened. He gathered his scattered belongings and resumed his walk home, his head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. This wasn't the first time Jaden had faced prejudice, but it was the first time it had cut so deeply. As he walked, a new resolve began to take shape within him. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to fight back, not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever been made to feel less than human. The hidden strength. The house was eerily quiet when Jaden stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. His prosthetic leg made a dull thud against the wooden floor, a sound he had grown used to over the years. Normally, the silence of his home was comforting, a refuge from the world outside. But today, it felt heavy, suffocating. Jaden dropped his backpack onto the floor and sat down on the couch, staring at the prosthetic in his hands. His fingers traced the scratches and dents left by the sheriff's rough handling. Each mark seemed to tell a story of shame, anger, and resilience. He glanced up at the clock on the wall. His parents wouldn't be home for hours. His mother, Lyanna, was likely deep into her latest investigation, and his father, Michael, was probably locked in another meeting at the media company he owned. Jaden sighed. He was proud of his parents, but their absence often left him feeling alone. Alone, but not powerless. His mind replayed the events of the day. The sheriff's sneer, the crowd's silence, the way he had been reduced to nothing more than a suspect because of the color of his skin and the prosthetic on his leg. The anger he had suppressed earlier bubbled to the surface, and this time, he didn't push it down. He let it fuel him. Jaden stood and grabbed his backpack, pulling out his laptop. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the device, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. His father had always told him, when you face injustice, don't just react. Act. Do something that makes people listen. Jaden wasn't sure if what he was about to do would make people listen, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. He began typing, his words pouring out like a flood. Today, I was stopped by a man who was supposed to protect me. Instead, he humiliated me. He took away something that is a part of me and treated it like trash. He looked at me and saw a criminal, not a 12-year-old boy walking home from school. He saw the color of my skin and the prosthetic on my leg and decided that I didn't belong. But I do belong. And I'm tired of people like him telling me otherwise. Jaden paused, his hands trembling. He thought of the crowd that had gathered, the people who had watched but done nothing. He thought of the sheriff's mocking words and the way his prosthetic had felt so much heavier after being thrown to the ground. He took a deep breath and continued. To anyone reading this, I'm not sharing my story because I want pity. I'm sharing it because I want change. I want a world where kids like me can walk home without being stopped, questioned, and humiliated. I want a world where our differences are celebrated, not feared. And I won't stop speaking out until that world exists. He finished the post and stared at the screen. The words felt powerful, but they also felt raw, exposing a part of him he usually kept hidden. Jaden debated whether to hit post. He knew the potential consequences. His parents would find out. The sheriff might retaliate. But as he sat there, he realized that his fear of doing nothing outweighed his fear of speaking out. With a determined click, he posted the story to his private social media account. It wasn't public yet. He wanted to think through his next steps. But it felt like a small act of defiance, a way of reclaiming some of the dignity the sheriff had tried to strip away. Later that evening, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the heavy silence. Jaden looked up as the front door opened, and his mother walked in. carrying her bag and a stack of papers. She paused when she saw him sitting at the table, the prosthetic lying beside him. "Jaden?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "What happened?" Jaden hesitated. He had planned to tell her nothing, but the question lingered in her tone, sharp, probing, and maternal. Lyanna Matthews was not a woman to let things go unanswered. "It's nothing, Mom," he said, trying to sound casual. "Just a rough day." Lyanna's eyes narrowed as she set her things down and walked over to him. Her gaze fell on the prosthetic, and her brow furrowed. "That doesn't look like nothing," she said, picking it up gently. "What happened?" Jaden bit his lip, the emotions from earlier threatening to resurface. He wanted to keep this to himself, to handle it on his own. But as he looked into his mother's eyes, he saw something that made him reconsider, a fierce determination that mirrored his own. "A sheriff stopped me on my way home," Jaden began, his voice trembling. He took my prosthetic and threw it in the trash." Lyanna froze, the prosthetic still in her hands. Her expression shifted from confusion to anger, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "What?" she said, her voice low and steady, a tone Jaden recognized as the calm before the storm. "He said I was hiding something," Jaden continued, his words tumbling out now. "He didn't find anything, but he didn't care. He just wanted to humiliate me." Lyanna placed the prosthetic on the table carefully, as if it were something fragile. She knelt down in front of Jaden, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Jaden," she said, her voice softer now, "why didn't you call me or your father?" Jaden looked away, ashamed. "I didn't want to bother you," he admitted. "And I wanted to handle it myself." Lyanna sighed, pulling her son into a hug. "You're brave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't have to do this alone." As she pulled back, her eyes fell on his laptop. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the open screen. Jaden hesitated. "I wrote about what happened," he said. "I didn't post it publicly, but I'd wanted to." Lyanna read the words on the screen, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked back at Jaden. "This is powerful," she said, "and it's important. But if you want to share it, you need to be ready for what comes next." "What do you mean?" Jaden asked. "When you speak out, people will listen," Lyanna said. "Some will support you, others will try to tear you down. But no matter what, you have to stand by your truth." Jaden nodded, her words sinking in. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, something worth fighting for. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Lyanna smiled, a look of pride flashing across her face. "Then let's do this together." As they worked late into the night, refining Jaden's story and planning their next steps, the spark inside him began to grow into a flame. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for hope, for dignity, and for the future. And Jaden was determined to win. A spark ignites. The next morning, the weight of the previous day lingered in the air as Jaden sat at the kitchen table. His mother, Lyanna, had already left the house, her phone practically glued to her ear as she pieced together the beginnings of a plan. His father, Michael, sat across from him, sipping his coffee with a contemplative expression. Michael was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. His position as the owner of one of the most prominent TV networks in the country meant he understood the power of words and images better than most. When Lyanna had shared Jaden's story with him late last night, his first reaction had been anger. But as the hours wore on, anger turned into resolve. "You're sure you want to move forward with this?" Michael asked finally, breaking the silence. Jaden nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I have to," he said firmly. "If I stay silent, nothing will change." Michael studied his son for a moment, then set his coffee cup down. "Then we'll do this the right way," he said. "We'll make sure your voice is heard." Jaden felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had always admired his parents for their work, his mother's fearless investigative journalism, and his father's ability to use media as a tool for change. But now he was stepping into their world, and it was intimidating. "We'll start with your story," Michael continued. "Liana's already working on a segment for the evening news. We'll air your account of what happened, but we'll do more than that. We'll expose the systemic issues behind it. This isn't just about you, Jaden. It's about every kid who's ever been made to feel less than human." Jaden swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words settling on his shoulders. "What if people don't believe me?" he asked quietly. Michael's expression softened. "They will," he said, "because we'll show them the truth." By mid-afternoon, the Matthews living room had been transformed into a makeshift studio. Liana had arranged for a small production team to come over, and they set up cameras, lighting, and microphones with practiced efficiency. Jaden sat on the couch, feeling both nervous and determined as he watched the flurry of activity around him. Liana knelt in front of him, adjusting the microphone clip to his shirt. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," she said, her voice gentle. "I am," Jaden replied, meeting her gaze. "This is my story. I need to tell it." Liana smiled, pride evident in her eyes. "Okay," she said, standing up. "Just be yourself. Speak from the heart." The room grew quiet as the cameras rolled. Jaden took a deep breath, his hands resting on his prosthetic leg as he began to speak. "Yesterday I was walking home from school when a sheriff stopped me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to bubble up. "He accused me of hiding something in my prosthetic. He took it off and threw it in the trash. He humiliated me in front of a crowd of people, and no one did anything to stop him." He paused, his hands tightening on his leg. "I'm not sharing this because I want pity. I'm sharing this because it's not just about me. This happens to kids like me all the time. We're judged because of the way we look or the way we move. But we're more than that. I'm more than that." Jaden looked directly into the camera, his voice growing stronger. "I want people to see me, not just as a kid with a prosthetic leg, but as a person. I want to live in a world where I can walk home without fear, and I won't stop speaking out until that world exists." When he finished, the room was silent. Liana stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You were amazing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Michael, who had been watching from the corner, nodded in agreement. "This is just the beginning," he said. That evening, Jaden's story aired on national television. The segment included his heartfelt testimony, footage of the prosthetic's damage, and interviews with experts who spoke about the systemic issues that allowed incidents like this to happen. Liana's voiceover tied it all together, presenting the story not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern of injustice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForJaden and #WalkWithDignity. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of discrimination and support for Jaden's courage. Celebrities and activists amplified his story, calling for accountability and change. But not everyone was supportive. The sheriff's department released a statement denying any wrongdoing, claiming that the incident was a routine check and that Jaden's account was exaggerated. Trolls flooded Jaden's social media with hateful comments, questioning his integrity and accusing him of seeking attention. Jaden tried not to let the negativity affect him, but it was difficult. The comments stung, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Would anything really change? His parents noticed the shift in his mood. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, Michael spoke up. "Jaden, you're going to face resistance," he said. "Not everyone wants to see change, but you have to remember why you're doing this." Liana reached across the table, taking Jaden's hand. "You're not alone," she said. "You have us, and you have the people who believe in you. Focus on them." Jaden nodded, their words giving him strength. He realized that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed, and he wasn't going to back down. The next day, Jaden's story reached an even wider audience. His father's network aired follow-up segments, including interviews with community leaders, legal experts, and other young people who shared similar experiences. Jaden was invited to speak at a local rally, where he stood on a makeshift stage in front of a crowd of hundreds. "I'm here today because I believe in a better future," he said, his voice echoing through the park. "A future where kids like me don't have to be afraid to walk home. A future where we're judged by who we are, not what we look like." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy feeding Jaden's resolve. As he stepped down from the stage, a young girl with a prosthetic leg approached him, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're my hero," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jaden knelt down to her level, a smile spreading across his face. "You're the hero," he said. "Never forget that." As he walked away, his prosthetic leg creaking slightly with each step, Jaden felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The spark inside him had become a flame, and it was spreading. This was no longer just his fight. It was a movement, and it was only just beginning. The echoes of resistance. The rally had ignited a wave of support and brought new life to Jaden's story. Social media buzzed with calls for justice. Petitions demanding Sheriff Carter's resignation gathered thousands of signatures, and local leaders began publicly condemning the actions of the sheriff's department. But as the days passed, resistance to the movement also grew. On one hand, there were those who rallied behind Jaden, inspired by his bravery and determination. On the other, a storm of backlash began brewing, fueled by those who refused to acknowledge the systemic issues his story had highlighted. Jaden first noticed the shift one morning as he scrolled through his phone. Among the messages of encouragement and solidarity, there were hateful comments that made his stomach churn. Another kid looking for his 15 minutes of fame. Stop blaming the police for doing their job. Maybe he should have been more respectful. Why don't you people stop playing the victim and take some responsibility? The words cut deep, each one a reminder of how far the world still had to go. Jaden closed the app and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His parents had warned him this would happen, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. At school, the reaction was mixed. Some of his classmates treated him like a hero, asking for selfies and sharing his story with pride. Others whispered behind his back, their words dripping with suspicion or jealousy. "Do you think he made it up?" Jaden overheard one boy say in the hallway. "I mean, who just happens to have parents like that?" "Probably exaggerated," another voice replied. "People like him always want attention." Jaden clenched his fists, fighting the urge to confront them. Instead, he walked away, his head held high. He couldn't let their words distract him. He had bigger things to focus on. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department was scrambling to control the narrative. Sheriff Carter himself had gone on local television, dismissing Jaden's account as misunderstood, and claiming that he had acted within the bounds of his authority. "I was doing my duty," Carter said, his face stern. "We live in a dangerous world, and sometimes that means making tough calls. If that boy felt humiliated, I'm sorry for that, but my actions were lawful." The interview enraged Jaden. He sat on the couch with his parents, watching the broadcast in disbelief. "He's lying," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "He's making it sound like it was no big deal." Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is what people in power do," he said. "They deflect, deny, and try to control the story. But the truth is already out there, Jaden. People know what really happened." Lyanna nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not going to let him get away with this," she said. "We'll keep the pressure on." The Matthews family decided to escalate their efforts. Lyanna used her investigative skills to dig deeper into Sheriff Carter's record, uncovering a troubling pattern of complaints against him, many of which involved young black men like Jaden. The revelations painted a damning picture, and Lyanna wasted no time putting together a comprehensive expose that aired on the network's primetime slot. The segment was explosive. It included interviews with former deputies who described a culture of racial bias within the department, testimonies from victims who had faced similar mistreatment, and evidence of internal complaints that had been swept under the rug. The final piece of the puzzle was a leaked audio recording of Sheriff Carter making blatantly racist remarks during a private meeting. The public reaction was swift and intense. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office, holding signs that read "No justice, no peace, and accountability now." News outlets across the country picked up the story, amplifying the call for Carter's resignation. But the backlash was just as fierce. Supporters of the sheriff rallied in defense, accusing the Matthews family of waging a personal vendetta. Jaden's family began receiving threatening messages, some anonymous, others disturbingly specific. One night, as the family sat down for dinner, the phone rang. Lyanna answered, her expression darkening as she listened. "Who is this?" she demanded. The line went dead. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, concern etched on his face. Lyanna hesitated, then looked at Jaden. "Someone just threatened us," she said. "They said we need to back off." Jaden's heart sank. "Are we in danger?" he asked, his voice trembling. Michael stood, his jaw tightening. "We'll call the police," he said. "And we're installing more security." Lyanna reached for Jaden's hand. "This is what happens when you challenge power," she said softly. "But we can't let fear stop us. If we back down now, they win." Jaden nodded, though fear coiled in his stomach. He didn't want to put his family at risk, but he also couldn't abandon the fight. He had come too far to turn back now. Despite the threats, the momentum continued to grow. Jaden was invited to speak at more rallies and community events, his words inspiring others to share their stories. Each time he stepped onto a stage or appeared on a screen, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But he also felt the power of his voice, the ripple effect it created. One evening, as he sat in his room preparing for a speech, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a direct message from a boy named Malik, who lived in a neighboring town. "Hey, Jaden, I saw your story on the news. I just wanted to say thank you. Something similar happened to me last year, but I was too scared to tell anyone. Seeing you speak out made me realize I'm not alone." Jaden stared at the message, his chest tightening. He replied quickly, "You're not alone, Malik. None of us are. Stay strong and keep speaking up. You have more power than you know." For the first time in days, Jaden felt a flicker of hope. The hate and resistance were loud, but so was the support, and every voice that joined his made the fight a little stronger. The turning point came when the state attorney general announced an official investigation into Sheriff Carter and the department. The news was a victory for Jaden and his family, but it was also a reminder that the battle was far from over. As Jaden sat with his parents that night, planning their next steps, he realized that this fight was bigger than any one person. It wasn't just about holding one sheriff accountable. It was about dismantling a system that allowed people like him to be treated as less than human. "This isn't just my story anymore," Jaden said, looking at his parents. "It's ours. All of ours." Lyanna smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "And together," she said, "we're unstoppable." The flame inside Jaden burned brighter than ever, and he knew one thing for certain. The echoes of resistance would not drown out the call for justice. The tides began to turn. The next few weeks unfolded like a whirlwind. Jaden's story continued to dominate headlines, sparking both support and controversy. The investigation into Sheriff Carter's actions revealed a litany of misconduct, from racially biased policing to improper use of force. Each revelation bolstered Jaden's cause and brought the nation's attention to the systemic issues he had become a symbol of. For Jaden, life was anything but normal. Every day seemed to bring a new development, an interview request, an invitation to speak, or another protest to attend. Despite the mounting pressure, he remained steadfast. He knew the movement was bigger than him now, and he refused to let fear dictate his actions. But the pressure wasn't without cost. Jaden sat on the edge of his bed one evening, staring at the prosthetic he had placed on the floor. It was still scratched and dented from the day the sheriff had ripped it off, and though it functioned fine, it served as a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured. Jaden. His mother's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Lyanna stood in the doorway, her face soft with concern. "You've been quiet today," she said, stepping into the room. "Are you okay?" Jaden shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I'm fine." Lyanna sat beside him, her presence comforting yet persistent. "You don't have to be fine," she said gently. "You've been through so much, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed." Jaden hesitated, then sighed. "It's just a lot," he admitted. "Sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I try, there's always going to be people who don't believe me or think I'm just trying to get attention." Lyanna placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jaden, change is hard. It's messy and uncomfortable, and it always comes with resistance. But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Jaden looked at her, his eyes searching for reassurance. What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes? "It already has," Lyanna said firmly. "Look at the people you've inspired. Look at the conversations you've started. That's change, Jaden, and it's only the beginning." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, easing the weight on his chest. He nodded, a small spark of determination reigniting within him. "You're right," he said. "I can't stop now." The next morning, Jaden woke to an email from his school principal. It was a formal invitation to speak at an upcoming assembly about his experiences and the importance of standing up for justice. The principal, a reserved but well-meaning woman named Ms. Carson, had been one of the few adults in Jaden's life to openly support his cause. The assembly was set for the following Friday, and Jaden spent the days leading up to it carefully crafting his speech. He wanted it to be more than just a retelling of what had happened. He wanted to leave his classmates with something to think about, something to carry with them long after the assembly was over. When the day arrived, Jaden stood backstage in the school auditorium, clutching the note cards he had prepared. The hum of voices from the packed audience reached his ears, and his nerves prickled. "You've got this," Lyanna said, standing beside him. She had taken the morning off to be there, her unwavering support giving him strength. Jaden nodded, taking a deep breath. As his name was announced, he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. He walked to the podium, his prosthetic clicking softly against the wooden floor, and faced the sea of faces before him. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady but soft. "My name is Jaden Matthews, and I want to tell you a story." He recounted the events of that fateful day, the sheriff's accusations, the humiliation, and the crowd's silence. He spoke about how it had made him feel and how those feelings had fueled his decision to speak out. "But this isn't just my story," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's the story of so many people who faced injustice simply because of who they are. It's the story of people who've been judged by the color of their skin, their abilities, or their differences." Jaden paused, letting his words sink in. "We all have a choice," he said. "We can stay silent when we see injustice, or we can stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' I chose to stand up, and I hope you will too." The auditorium erupted into applause as Jaden stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and pride. He had done it. He had shared his truth, and the response was more than he could have hoped for. As Jaden left the stage, his classmates and teachers approached him, their words of support and encouragement washing over him like a wave. Even some of the students who had doubted him before now seemed to see him in a new light. But it wasn't just the school that was taking notice. The assembly had been live-streamed on the school's website, and by the end of the day, clips of Jaden's speech had gone viral. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JadenSpeaks and #BeTheChange, and news outlets picked up the story, further amplifying his message. That evening, as Jaden sat with his family in the living room, his phone buzzed with notifications. Among them was an email from a prominent civil rights organization, inviting him to speak at their national conference. "Wow," Lyanna said, reading over his shoulder. "This is big." Jaden looked up at his parents, a mixture of excitement and nervousness in his eyes. "Do you think I should do it?" Michael nodded. "Absolutely," he said. "Your voice is making a difference, Jaden. This is your chance to take it even further." Jaden smiled, the weight of his earlier doubts lifting. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about one moment or one injustice. It was about building a future where no kid would have to go through what he had. As he lay in bed that night, Jaden stared at the ceiling, his mind buzzing with possibilities. The fight wasn't over, but the tides were beginning to turn. And he was ready to ride the wave. The ripple effect. The following days were a blur of preparation as Jaden got ready for the Civil Rights Conference. The event was one of the largest in the country, drawing activists, leaders, and influencers from all walks of life. Jaden felt the enormity of the moment pressing down on him, but with his parents' guidance and the support of the community, he began to find his footing. Lyanna helped him craft his speech, encouraging him to dig deeper into his experiences and draw connections to the broader fight for justice. Michael worked behind the scenes, arranging interviews and ensuring the story continued to stay in the public eye. Meanwhile, Jaden's peers at school rallied around him, offering words of encouragement and even helping him practice his speech during lunch breaks. When the day of the conference arrived, Jaden found himself standing backstage at a massive convention center, his heart pounding as he listened to the buzz of the crowd. The auditorium was packed with thousands of people, and the energy in the room was electric. "You ready?" Lyanna asked, standing beside him. Jaden nodded, his hands gripping the note cards he had spent hours perfecting. "I think so." "You've got this," Michael said, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Just remember, you're not alone up there. Every word you say is for the people who've been through what you have." The MC's voice echoed through the room, introducing Jaden as the next speaker. The applause was deafening as he walked onto the stage, his prosthetic clicking softly against the polished floor. He stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd, and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "My name is Jaden Matthews, and I'm here today because of something that happened to me. A moment that changed my life forever." He told his story once more, but this time, he went deeper. He spoke about the pain of being reduced to a stereotype, the humiliation of having his humanity stripped away, and the anger that had fueled his decision to speak out. He talked about the fear he had felt, but also the hope that had emerged as people began to rally around him. "This isn't just my story," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's the story of so many people who have faced injustice, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are. And it's a story that needs to end." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. "We all have a responsibility to stand up against injustice," Jaden continued, "not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. Because every time we choose to stay silent, we allow the cycle to continue. And every time we speak out, we create a ripple that can grow into a wave of change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I didn't ask to be part of this fight," he said. "But now that I'm here, I'm not backing down. And I hope none of you will either." The room erupted into applause as Jaden stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and exhilaration. He had done it. He had shared his truth, and the response was more than he could have imagined. After his speech, Jaden was swarmed by people wanting to meet him. Activists, community leaders, and even a few politicians approached him, praising his courage and asking how they could support his cause. One woman, a seasoned civil rights lawyer, handed him her card. "If you ever need legal support," she said, her voice firm, "you call me. We need more young voices like yours." Jaden thanked her, feeling both humbled and empowered. He realized that his story had become a catalyst for something much bigger than himself. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about creating a world where no one else would have to endure the same pain. That evening, as Jaden and his parents returned home, they found a small crowd waiting for them on their front lawn. Neighbors, friends, and classmates had gathered to welcome him back, holding signs that read, "We stand with Jaden," and "Justice for all." Jaden stepped out of the car, his eyes wide with surprise. "What is this?" he asked. One of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harris, stepped forward. "This is our way of saying thank you," she said, her voice warm. "For standing up, for speaking out, and for reminding us that we all have a role to play." Jaden felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at the crowd. These were the same people who had once watched his story from a distance, unsure of how to react. Now they were standing with him, united in their support. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "This means so much." As the crowd cheered, Jaden felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but he knew he wasn't alone. Together, they were creating a ripple that was quickly becoming a wave. And Jaden was ready to ride it all the way to the shore. The legacy takes root. The Civil Rights Conference had been a monumental moment for Jaden, but it was only the beginning of what became a larger movement. The attention his story received had turned him into an unlikely but effective leader. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities, and Jaden found himself navigating a world he had never imagined. It had been weeks since his speech, and life was anything but quiet. Jaden was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a notebook filled with ideas for his next steps. His prosthetic leg rested beside him, the same one that had been damaged by Sheriff Carter, though now repaired and strengthened by a local engineer who had been moved by his story. "Jaden," Lyanna called from the living room. "Turn on the TV. They're covering the investigation." He rushed into the room, joining his parents on the couch as they watched the evening news. The screen showed a familiar image of Sheriff Carter, his face stoic but noticeably tense. The anchor's voice echoed in the background. "Following a thorough investigation by the Attorney General's office, Sheriff Bill Carter has been placed on administrative leave pending further review of numerous complaints. The department faces allegations of systemic misconduct, including racial profiling and excessive use of force. Advocates, including Jaden Matthews and his family, have called for significant reforms." Jaden's heart raced as he listened. It was a step forward, though he knew there was still a long road ahead. "Administrative leave," Lyanna said, crossing her arms. "It's not enough." "It's a start," Michael replied. "But we need to make sure this momentum doesn't fade." Jaden looked between his parents, the gears in his mind turning. "What if we do more than just react to this?" he said. "What if we create something lasting?" Lyanna raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "A foundation," Jaden said, his voice gaining confidence as the idea took shape. "Something that supports kids like me, kids who've been through things like this, but don't know how to speak up or where to turn." Michael leaned forward, intrigued. A foundation could amplify the message and create real, systemic change. "Exactly," Jaden said. "We could offer legal support, organize community events, and even work with schools to teach kids about their rights." Lyanna smiled, pride evident in her eyes. "I think it's a brilliant idea." And just like that, the Matthews family began laying the groundwork for what would become the Justice for All Foundation. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and late nights spent drafting plans. The foundation quickly gained traction, thanks to Jaden's growing platform and his parents' network of contacts. Local businesses pledged their support, lawyers offered pro bono services, and activists reached out to collaborate. One of the first initiatives Jaden proposed was a mentorship program for young people who had experienced discrimination. He wanted to provide a space where they could share their stories, find community, and learn how to advocate for themselves. The inaugural event for the foundation was held at a local community center. Jaden stood at the entrance, greeting attendees as they arrived. The room quickly filled with kids, parents, and community members, all eager to be part of something bigger. As the event began, Jaden took the stage. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This foundation isn't just about me or my story. It's about all of us coming together to create a world where justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy fueling Jaden's resolve. He spent the rest of the evening connecting with attendees, listening to their stories, and sharing his vision for the future. One moment in particular stood out to him. A young boy named Marcus, no older than 10, approached him with his mother. Marcus wore a small prosthetic on his left leg, and his eyes were wide with admiration. "Hi, Jaden," Marcus said shyly. "I saw you on TV. You're really brave." Jaden knelt down to his level, smiling. "Thank you, Marcus. You're brave too." Marcus's mother placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "He's been struggling at school," she explained. "The other kids don't always understand, and it's been hard for him to feel like he belongs." Jaden looked at Marcus, his heart aching with familiarity. "You do belong," he said firmly. "And don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Marcus nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. As they walked away, Jaden felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was why he was fighting. For kids like Marcus. For every person who had ever felt invisible or unheard. As the foundation grew, so did the impact of Jaden's story. Schools across the country began inviting him to speak, and he worked tirelessly to use his platform to advocate for policy changes. His social media accounts became hubs for activism, with people sharing their stories and ideas for making a difference. One day, Jaden received an email that left him speechless. It was from a senator's office, inviting him to testify at a congressional hearing on racial justice and policing reform. The invitation felt surreal, but Jaden knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The hearing was held in Washington, D.C., in a grand chamber filled with lawmakers, reporters, and advocates. Jaden sat at a long table, flanked by legal experts and community leaders. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and looked out at the audience. "My name is Jaden Matthews," he began, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "I'm here today because I believe in a future where justice is not a privilege, but a right. I've seen firsthand what happens when we allow prejudice and discrimination to go unchecked. But I've also seen the power of people coming together to demand change." He shared his story once more, but this time, he spoke not just as a victim, but as an advocate and a leader. He outlined the changes he believed were necessary, from better training for law enforcement to stronger accountability measures. "We have the power to create a better world," he said in closing. "But it starts with us. The choices we make, the voices we amplify, and the actions we take. I'm just one voice, but together, we can be a chorus that no one can ignore." The room erupted into applause as Jaden finished. As he stepped away from the table, he felt a sense of pride and fulfillment unlike anything he had ever experienced. Months later, Jaden stood on the stage of a national award ceremony, accepting a humanitarian award for his work. The room was filled with people who had supported him throughout his journey. His family, friends, and countless others who had joined the movement he had started. As he looked out at the crowd, Jaden thought about how far he had come. What had started as a moment of humiliation and pain had grown into a movement for justice and change, and while the fight was far from over, he knew that every step he took was making a difference. "This award isn't just for me," Jaden said, his voice clear and strong. "It's for every person who's ever been told they don't belong. It's for every kid who's ever felt invisible. And it's for all of us who believe in a better, fairer world. Together, we can make it happen." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the room. Jaden stood tall, his prosthetic gleaming under the lights, a symbol of resilience and hope. The fight wasn't over, but Jaden knew one thing for certain: his story, and the stories of those he fought for, had taken root. And from those roots, a legacy of justice and equality was growing, one step at a time. The legacy of justice. After the award ceremony, Jaden returned home to his quiet town, now a place that no longer felt the same. The streets that once held his humiliation now carried the weight of his triumphs. He walked the familiar route from school to his house, his prosthetic leg clicking against the pavement as neighbors waved and greeted him warmly. It was a stark contrast to the indifference he had once known. The Justice for All Foundation continued to grow. Its mentorship programs expanded nationwide, offering young people a chance to connect, heal, and become advocates for themselves and their communities. Legal clinics popped up in underserved areas, providing free support to families who had experienced discrimination. The foundation also launched a scholarship program, helping kids like Marcus pursue their dreams. Jaden remained at the forefront of the movement, but he was no longer alone. The kids he had inspired became leaders in their own right, speaking out in their schools, communities, and beyond. The ripple he had started had turned into a wave, carrying countless others with it. One day, as Jaden sat in his office at the foundation's headquarters, a modest but bustling space filled with the buzz of activity, he received a phone call from Marcus's mother. "Jaden," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. Marcus got into the STEM program he's been dreaming about. He told me it was because of you." Jaden smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "He did that himself," he said. "He's amazing." "You gave him the courage to believe that," she replied. "And I'll never forget it." After the call ended, Jaden sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far they had come. The world wasn't perfect. There were still battles to fight and voices to uplift. But progress was undeniable. A few years later, Jaden found himself back in the same auditorium where he had given his first school assembly. The walls were now adorned with posters celebrating diversity and inclusion, part of a new initiative the school had implemented in partnership with the foundation. Jaden was there to speak once more, this time as a young man preparing to head to college. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and community members, all eager to hear from the boy who had become a symbol of hope. "Good morning," Jaden began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced the worst and emerged stronger. "The last time I stood here, I told you my story. Today, I want to talk about your stories." He paused, scanning the room. "Each of you has the power to make a difference. You don't have to wait for something big to happen. Change starts with the choices you make every day. How you treat each other, how you stand up for what's right, and how you refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice." The crowd hung on his every word, their faces a mix of admiration and determination. "Remember," he said in closing, "one voice can start a ripple. But together, we can create a wave that changes the world." The room erupted into applause, and Jaden stepped off the stage, shaking hands and exchanging hugs with students who had been inspired by his journey. Among them was Marcus, now a teenager with a bright smile and a confident stride. "You're the reason I'm here today," Marcus said. "Thank you." Jaden placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his own smile spreading. "No, Marcus. You're the reason we're all here. Keep going. You've got this." That evening, Jaden returned home, the sky painted with the warm hues of a setting sun. He walked into the living room, where his parents were waiting. Lyanna had a scrapbook open on her lap, filled with photos and newspaper clippings documenting Jaden's journey. "You've come so far," she said, her voice tinged with pride and nostalgia. Michael nodded. "And you've shown the world what one voice can do." Jaden sat beside them, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, "without all of us." As the family sat together, sharing stories and laughter, Jaden felt a profound sense of peace. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been filled with triumphs, connections, and hope. And as he looked out the window, watching the last light of day fade into the horizon, he knew the fight for justice would continue. But it wasn't just his fight anymore. It belonged to all the people who had joined him, to the kids who had found their voices, and to the future they were building together. Jaden's story had started with pain, but it had blossomed into something beautiful, a legacy of courage, resilience, and unwavering belief in the power of change. And that legacy would endure for generations to come.